now we're going to talk about culture a little bit, and I think you've heard it most of the day, why a compliance mindset only does not equate to higher quality of what you do or products. But having said that, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing not only a good friend of mine, but a colleague from a former lifetime that managed a sizable law department at a small IT company called Change Healthcare. She happened to be the executive vice president and managing counsel for a few years with Change Healthcare, and then formerly in similar roles with a really small company called McKesson, and then another one, NCR. Now, she's also an award winner. She's been on the feature cover of many legal magazines for as long as I've known her. She has championed both compliance and cultures in Fortune 10 and Fortune 100 companies in her career. She's had the ear of the board of directors and the senior executives running these little companies, keeping them, I think we're auxiliary, from wearing orange jumpsuits or something like that, keeping them on the right path. She's also retired semi, at least for, I don't know, for a while. Few more months. And she's writing a book. And she has told me it is going to be on the New York Times bestseller coming up pretty soon. And also in her free time, not only does she swim, but she's taken up ballroom dancing with the idea of competing, what, next year? Maybe?
We'll get to that.
Okay. So anyway, without further ado, Loretta Cecil, one of the best leaders I have ever come across in the 35, 40 years I've been doing this. So it's all yours.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Paul. Thank you. It's a great honor and pleasure to be with everyone today. Paul sent me at my request a list of the attendees. And when I saw who was attending both from the government, FDA, as well as industry, it was like, wow, it's got a lot of experts in the room, much more expert than I will ever be. So I appreciate you paying attention to me this afternoon, giving me some time. I'll try and talk a little bit about executive teams and sort of what they're interested in relative to quality and regulation. But before I do that, I do want to give you a perspective on sort of what your role is and sort of how you can, in essence, equate yourselves to a great ballroom dancer. So if you see the photograph here, I've got a couple of photographs here with Tristan Sanders. Young man here with me in every one of these photographs. Again, his name is Tristan Sanders. He's 25 years old, so there are 42 years difference in our age. Tristan has now been my teacher, my partner, my mentor in the ballroom dancing world since November of last year. So on a lark, I decided I wanted to try something new, given that I was going to be sort of not working for a few months at least. And so I asked my daughter, who is a very good musician, very good dancer, to find me the right partner. And so she did a lot of interviewing in the Atlanta area, looking at studios. Do we have any ballroom dancers in the room already? One over here. Good, good. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. Ballroom dancing studios, like other studios, there can be the gold standard, and then there can be the ones that you never want to go into, right? They're dirty, they've got kids all in them, you cannot concentrate, etc. But in any event, my daughter found the perfect ballroom studio for me with the perfect teacher, again, with Tristan. And so all of you are the Tristans of the world. All of you, when you think about it in terms of what you do within your companies, what you do within your government agency, you are the Tristans of the world, because you are taking a neophyte, an uninformed, someone that doesn't know anything about quality, regulation, medical devices, how they're impacted, how they're, in essence, going to be regulated, and you're teaching You're teaching, you're demonstrating the importance of that. And so there's a real interconnection here between ballroom dancing and what you're doing. You are all the Tristans of the world. Tristan took me when I did not know how to do anything, and he started out basically with the following instructions. And my friend over here in the corner will know exactly what I'm talking about. Number one was understanding the human touch, getting comfortable. I'm a single woman. Getting comfortable being able to put your hands on another human being who happens to be a male in a very tight configuration, and to do it within the terms of the body boundary rules of ballroom dancing, which has a lot of boundary rules in terms of how you do it. So we went from how do you basically hold hands and put yourself in the embrace with another human being, all the way to competing. Now we've now competed in 4 different competitions. We're now competing in 15 different dance styles. And so my friend here knows that that is quite the achievement. And so how did we do it? We did it with commitment on his part, taking someone that was going to try his patience every single day that I walked into that dance studio, which I did, to the point with me being willing to understand and ask questions, and also being very comfortable in a very uncomfortable topic for myself. So it took a real partnership with Tristan and myself to do that. And then it took weeks and weeks and weeks and months and months and months of work. So I basically said to Tristan, after we got through the, can I put my hands on your shoulder? Can you put your hand on my back? How close can we get? Once we got through all of that, I told him I wanted to go into the deep end of the pool, or the deep end all around the ballroom floor. And so I started taking lessons from him 5 days a week. And we basically have now achieved a lot in a very short period of time. And I'm very proud of this young man. And I can't wait to see where his career is going to be. I really believe that one day he's going to be on Dancing with the Stars. He's that good. To tell you a little bit about Tristan, to put it in perspective, because all of you are Tristans. Tristan was a gymnast all through middle school. He was a gymnast all through high school, and he went to college on a gymnast scholarship. And then within his first year got significantly injured. And so he dropped out of college and then took on a life of being a very successful hip-hop dancer. He did that for a while. He got injured even more. If you know a lot about hip-hop, you know that there's a lot of movement that takes place, a lot of jumping, et cetera. So he finally decided to do a dance routine that he could do for his entire life that was a little bit more manageable. So he became a ballroom dancing teacher. He is one of the few African Americans in the ballroom dancing community in the country. And so I'm very proud of him in terms of what he wants to achieve. So all of you are the Tristans of the world. You've all had different situations in your careers that have probably been setbacks. You've all had the Loretta Cecils of the world walk into your office knowing nothing about quality, having no interest in quality, really wanting to do nothing other than you want them to leave your office. So you're the Tristans of the world. You're the absolute Tristans of the world. And I will tell you that if you will put in the time and effort to work with your partner, even though she may not know anything about dancing, it will pay off. And that's the message that I want to give you about the executive teams that you're working with. So let's talk about executive teams, because I have had the pleasure of working with several of them. The executive teams that I have all worked for, I was at AT&T for 18 years. I entered that company at the height of the breakup of the Bell system, the invention of the internet, and the invention of wireless. So I sold and worked on helping take that company from basically archaic technology systems to what we now experience today in terms of how we love the technology that's at our fingertips today. Trust me, for those of you that are a little bit older than me, you know that in 1996, nobody really knew what the internet was, how fast we've come on that. So it was an industry that was very interesting. It was incredibly fascinating to watch the board of directors and the executive team who had fought the Department of Justice for over 40 years on the antitrust case. whenever they finally said, we're going to break up the Bell system. So that was the first industry in which I worked in. I can tell you that the ability to talk clearly and to do long-range planning and to be able to predict in that regulatory environment was the thing that that board of directors focused on more than anything, because it was the most important thing that was impacting shareholder value at that particular point in time. Then I moved into and worked for a few years at NCR Corporation, and the technology change there was moving from cash registers where someone stood behind the cash register to self-service. So I supported the self-service product. We rolled it out to Walmart, Home Depot, and Lowe's, filled with problems because of financial regulations. If you just think about the way that you now go to a self-service terminal now, it just looks like it works flawlessly. Just the mechanics of understanding the weight of the product that you're putting in the bag and whether or not you can match that to a barcode with the correct price so that you don't have theft, people walking out, basically tricking the system. There were so many problems with how that particular product got rolled out, but it was highly regulated as well. It was a very interesting transition. And then when I went into healthcare in 2006 at McKesson and then Change Healthcare, that was really focused for me on electronic medical records, other aspects of healthcare technology that were not necessarily patient-facing. So you don't think of them as being traditional medical devices. The other thing that's kind of interesting about my career in terms of the advice that I can give you is that at all the companies that I worked at in the medical space, in the healthcare space, medical devices were not their number one product. And so you're working at a company where most of the revenue comes from non-medical device products, but you have one or two very critical medical device products, and trying to explain that to an executive team where you don't have a chief medical officer, but you have a chief technology officer, where you don't have a CEO who has been to medical school or has practiced or understands the technology related to medical devices. That's quite the challenge. And that's one of the things that Paul and I worked on, which was getting mind share for them to be able to appreciate how important this topic was, even though it wasn't 90% of our revenue. So that's the background that I have in terms of dealing with executive teams. What do I think executive teams need to know and think about as they particularly want to focus on quality? Well, let's just sort of, if I were walking into an executive meeting, we'll talk about executive meetings before boards. The thing that you need to appreciate is that they're a group of experts, and they like to stay in their dance lane or their swim lane. They've got a favorite dance, and they like to really focus on that favorite dance. They're a waltzer, and they basically want everything to be about waltzes. They could care less about cha-cha-cha, but you're cha-cha-cha. And you got to find a way to kind of get through to that executive who's only focused on the waltz, that you've got a cha-cha-cha problem. And it is a burning problem because you're dancing it in 2 days. Now, the reason that I say that they're experts like that is because that's the way executive teams historically have grown up here in the United States in particular. Now, who are the experts? Who am I talking about? The CFO. I've worked with phenomenal CFOs. They're just great, but they are so expert in what they do. The chief human resources or chief people officer, great. But they're experts in what they know. The closest you come to someone that's going to be able to sort of look at all those experts and all those horizons is the CEO. And the CEO generally, in my opinion, the four companies where I have worked, they depend very heavily on the general counsel and the compliance leader in particular, because there's so much that's being talked about. And they, in essence, want to know at the end of the day, what is really true, what is hyperbole, what is exaggerated, what needs to be done now, what needs to be done in 2 years, what never needs to be done. And so you sitting there as Tristan again, supporting that CEO or that person that doesn't really understand what you're dealing with, you've got a really incredible role that you can play there. But you've got to figure out who the experts are and how are you basically going to communicate that to the CEO. One thing I will say in terms of the different experts that are going to be in the room is that they all want to do a really good job. And they all really want to understand particularly what quality is in the various areas, particularly relative to medical devices. But it is so way over their head. Their heads are buzzing with whatever is in their particular area of expertise. Their heads buzzing about basically making sure that waltz is perfect as opposed to the cha-cha-cha. And so I think your responsibility and the true value that you can add in terms of improving the quality of dialogue within the executive team is to give them a break. So one of the things that I always did was I knew who within my executive team was least informed about a topic, had less interest in the topic, and so I always, before we had a meeting, would take time and meet with them and talk with them one-on-one in a conversation about what the issue was. I would give them sort of the Cliff Notes version of what the regulations were. I made them look really good in the meeting because they could then ask the appropriate questions or they could react in the appropriate way. So you got to understand that everybody has an expertise and everybody has a love, and it's your responsibility and your sweet spot, like Tristan does with me, to sort of figure out a way to get my attention to make me want to do the cha-cha-cha when waltz is my favorite dance. And waltz is my favorite dance, and cha-cha-cha is my least favorite dance. For sure, for sure. So when you think about what I've got on the slide here, and you're thinking about the experts are always going to say initially, well, is this a distraction or is this really going to be a competitive advantage? And I think generally every situation that we're dealing with is probably some amount of a distraction, and it's probably also some amount of a competitive advantage. And I think you will go a long way in terms of gaining credibility and being able to tell the story if you can figure out how to talk with them about it being both. But at some point in time, the balance of the scales, you're going to have to make a decision and convince them that it's probably a competitive advantage if it's rising to the level of being a quality issue. But you don't want to go in there, in my opinion, and just say, this is going to be a competitive advantage. Let me tell you, Mr. Executive or Miss Executive, this is going to be a competitive advantage. They have heard that 1,000,000 times. They've heard it from product managers. They've heard it from marketeers. They've heard it from lawyers. They've heard it from financial types, et cetera. So what you want to do is you want to embrace and play the game of, it's going to be some of both. But at the end of the day, we're going to basically make a decision that's going to be a competitive advantage. Don't ignore the fact that distractions always are on their brain. Complicated or clear? Again, this gets to knowing the audience and knowing who are your experts, particularly those that need more help. Those are the ones that you want to focus on. I know a lot of people say, hey, I got an executive team of 10 people in there. I got 10 votes in there. I got a really smart CFO. He's going to be able to pull me 2 or 3 votes, so I'm going to go in and basically give a 5-minute presentation to the CFO and consider that I've got the vote. I don't believe that that's the right way to do it. You go to the weakest member of that executive team in terms of the least knowledge, and you basically have the discussion and dialogue with them in advance, and then they will be able to help you bring it along. So another thing I will recommend, particularly for those that are struggling with the executive who's not as interested or doesn't have as much knowledge, are pre-reads. You know, in the olden days when we were growing up in corporate America or in the government, everybody had a slide deck. Slide 1, slide 2, slide 3, slide 4. They had these massive slide decks, and you basically reviewed the slide decks in meetings like this. Well, there's been a development in corporate America, and I think this is a good one, I support it, to basically put together a narrative which explains the problem, which gives the history. It's basically telling a story. It's like writing a book. on whatever the topic is that you have. And you provide that pre-read, that narrative, such that when you get to the slide deck goes from 50 pages or 20 pages down to 2 or 3. And then you're able to have a dialogue as opposed to just basically grinding through, slide and bullet point after bullet point after bullet point. I will tell you that if you're going to do the narratives, though, and you're going to do pre-reads, they're really hard to do. I would much rather do a 50-page slide deck than a 50-page narrative. Because if I'm writing a 50-page narrative, I'm working on that thing, I'm writing it, I'm editing it, et cetera. So build in enough time if you're going to do a pre-read that you can actually write it, and write it in such a way that it's set up in a very simplistic way, and then you get your punchline in there. The other thing is, I think you should always address this now or never, never or now. It's cost-based decision. The executive team, as the expert, Tristan, you're trying to get Loretta out on the dance floor. The executive team is looking for you to basically help them decide, is this a now decision or is it a never decision? And what are the costs and the puts and takes that are going into that? I know a lot of times we want to sort of walk away. We're the quality professional, or we're the compliance professional, or we're the general counsel, or whatever your position may be. It's like, I'm just going to give them the facts. I'm going to give them the scenarios. I'm going to give them what could happen, this could happen, et cetera, and then I'm going to let them make the decision. You will gain a lot more credibility if you go in there with a position and you can advocate what your position is. They can disagree with you, but I always went in with, here's what we should do, here's what's going to cost, here's why we do it now, or here's why we do it in 2 years from now or 3 years from now. And the other thing I want to mention is just in terms of, I've mentioned CFOs in particular, all the CFOs that I have dealt with, a lot of people give them a hard time in terms of, well, they're bean counters or they're never going to want to do anything. They're always going to be looking to maximize profits, and so the CFOs are never going to basically fund a quality program that is of the magnitude that perhaps you're recommending. I disagree with that. I think really good CFOs, they're looking many quarters down the path. They're also dealing with a situation where they've made, particularly for public companies, they've made a projection to the street. And so a good CFO wants to stay right in that sweet spot of the projection. They don't want to miss it, and they don't want to go too high. They want to stay right there, what it is. So if you have a CFO that is seeing that the company is basically making more and is going to, if it had to, report out higher, they will then strategically say, okay, let's do some additional programs. What do we need to do? Do we need to basically bolster up any of the programs in the company? That's a perfect opportunity if you're close enough in the process to be able to say, this is the time to do a very advantageous addition to our quality program, or to review it, to do the audit this year in 6 months as opposed to later, those kinds of things. So just make sure that you own part of the decision and the recommendation on now or never. And then the final thing that I will mention in terms of dealing with executive teams is you really got to address and embrace this. Is it going to be a waste or is it going to be a success? And there are 3 really dimensions for that, for the company, for the shareholders, obviously then for the regulators that you're going to be dealing with and have been dealing with, and then finally, certainly for the user community, the patient community. And I think you'd be amazed that most executive teams, they want to spend a lot more time on the waste or success because they really, in my opinion, want to do the right thing, but they don't know enough sometimes in order to make a determination. Is it going to be a waste or is it going to be a success? And so you need to keep track of some of those things. Affirmatively bring into the room, look, we did this in the quality program 3 years ago, and here are the metrics that we can show in terms of better customer satisfaction, better patient safety, whatever your metrics are in terms of how you're measuring it. You bring those affirmatively into the room, even though it may never be a topic that executive team heard anything about because you were the Tristans and you were taking care of it appropriately. And so once you're able to show, I've got a track record, or we've got a track record of basically being able to determine where it's been successful as opposed to necessarily being a waste or not needed, you get you get a lot of traction within it. You get a lot of traction within it. So Paul, I'm sure I've probably used all my time up now, but hopefully that's what you were asking me to do. And we had lunch a few weeks ago and said, can you at least talk about what it's like to deal with an executive team? Is everybody now, you're all Tristans, right? You're all Tristans, right?
I'm not a ballroom dancer.
Well, come and see.
So thank you, Loretta. No,
You're welcome.
that was perfect. Any questions before we get Mr. Schaefer out here in the panel? So one thing I learned early on, number one, I used to be one of these jokesters that loved lawyer jokes, and this phenomenal opportunity came up in my life. Said, hey, we're changing culture. We need to develop a QA RA group for corporate offices for this company called McKesson. I said, okay, I've never worked for a Fortune 10 company before, so I said, okay, let me check it out. And the first meeting I had with Loretta was, are they drinking out of the same Kool-Aid? And I just kind of, what? Kool-Aid? So now I've learned over the years working with her what she really meant and how that relates to culture, and that's one of the reasons why I brought you here. So, Pat, why don't you go ahead and start?
Great. Well, I'm going to bring the whole panel out.
You're going to bring the whole
I think
panel.
it's time to bring the panel out.
Hey.
All
Loretta,
right.
thank you
Friends.
so much.
They're all coming to ballroom dance, Loretta.
Yeah.
Oh, no, here, I'll sit at
How
the
many
end.
seats? How many people? There we go.
I got it.
All right.
You like me. You know I don't. Right.
So first of all, Loretta, thank you very much. Very much appreciate it. We have a distinguished panel here today, and some have already been introduced. You've been introduced, Loretta, and Cisco, you've been introduced. Joe, we know who you are, but I was wondering if Jackie,
I don't know how to take that one.
if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Jackie Torfin. I have been in industry for about 35 years as a head of quality and regulatory in a variety of medical device companies. I'm currently an independent consultant with QRX Consultants. That's my own company.
Great, thank you. Kareem?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Kareem El Wakil. I'm a partner with PwC. I focus on pharma life sciences consulting and specifically quality transformation within that space.
Great. And Zillary, please.
I am Zillary Fortner. I'm from Sparta Honeywell. I'm the product advisor for QARA Life Sciences, and I've been in the industry for 25 plus years, but on the surgical arena side.
Great, thank you. And I'm Pat Schaefer. I lead the regulatory and quality practice at FDI Consulting, but have been involved with Case for Quality for a good number of years, probably too many to calculate. I wonder if we could go, Savannah, to the next slide, which talks a little bit about the history. We've actually, George Serafin's in the audience. He brought me into the Case for Quality many years ago when we were first working on defining what the programs would be. One of our first set of programs was a series of initiatives around the VIP program, which was started as a competency group. And then around 2018, it was time for a refresh. And we started a new organization or a new working group called Leadership Engagement. And a lot of the people who were on the panel were involved with leadership engagement, also George Zach, who you saw earlier, and others. And we, in developing or understanding leadership engagement, which ties in very much, Loretta, to what you were talking about, we identified several factors that leadership should be aware of. We developed a playbook, and one of those factors was understanding culture and the impact that culture has on quality in terms of financial performance, quality in terms of patient safety, quality in terms of just the whole fabric of the organizational performance and excellence. More recently, once we published the playbook, we did a series of webinars, and then more recently, the steering committee met, and they decided, as was explained earlier, that we really need to look specifically at culture. And our team drew the short straw, and we were charged with figuring out, all right, what do we do with something that is incredibly intangible? Sort of like gravity, it's there, it has a significant impact on everything, but how do you use it to your advantage? How do you measure it? How do you harness the power of culture as opposed to having it impact you negatively? Savannah, could you go to the next slide? So the first thing we did as a team was say, all right, now what do we do? And we pulled together, or we came together and we said, all right, well, what are the driving forces behind culture? How do we define it? And people raised their hand and said, well, we've got to talk about communication. We've got to talk about digitalization and what digital is doing to the workforce. How is that impacting performance, quality, culture? We need to talk about skills and competencies. And these 7 factors, which also includes implementation, how do you actually implement the tools to achieve a culture that's going to support performance, support patient safety. So these were the 7 working groups that have formed. And each group is led by a different person, and that person is in charge of then going a step beyond what are the drivers of culture to defining, all right, well, what do we mean by leadership? What are the tools that we're going to develop? And this is the journey that we're on right now. These people, the leads and all the people you see on this list are dedicated. They meet typically twice a month, maybe even more often, to define how we go forward. The problem we have is that it's a relatively small group, and we need you, the people in this audience, to help us determine, well, we have some questions for you, which we'll present in a moment, but we also wonder, are there areas beyond these 7 that we need to consider in terms of how do we take culture and turn it into something that's going to help drive performance, drive safety, and drive product quality. If we could go to the next. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly describe what these different factors are, and then we're going to, and then I'm going to have to call up my copy so that I can actually read it. But I'll do it from here. So the first one is the disruptors, and a lot of people signed up for the disruptors, and they're defining. I'm going to step forward a little bit. They're defining disruptors as any change or modification, internally or externally caused, which impacts an organization, and their mission is to really identify and determine what mitigation is necessary and what factors are necessary to advance an organization's culture of quality when experiencing a disruptive activity. And disruptions can be anything, such as a tornado, or they can be bankruptcy or an acquisition, you name it. And then I'll present the questions a little bit later. Digitalization, we went back and forth between digitization and digitalization, is transforming business processes by leveraging digital technologies. And their mission is to basically assist an organization in enhancing their quality culture through these technologies. Let's go to the next slide, please. Leadership. Leadership is collaborate. Their goal is to collaborate and influence people at all levels of the organization in nurturing a culture of quality. One thing that's interesting here, when we first did the leadership engagement panel, it was CEO engagement. And then we quickly changed it to leadership engagement because we felt that this whole initiative has to go beyond just the CEO. And then now, as we've matured and we understand, and you'll see in the playbook, every person in the organization has a responsibility for culture and for quality. So, that is expanded quite a bit. And their mission is to really guide leaders in identifying the factors that support but also prevent their successful promotion of a culture of quality, which speaks exactly to what you were speaking about earlier. Measurement, use of metrics. How do you measure the intangible? How do you measure culture? How do you drive continuous improvement of culture? And their mission is not to actually define those metrics, but really to provide guidance on how to develop measures that can be used effectively. Things such as be proactive versus reactive. Let's go to the next slide. The communications team is focused on enhancing information and exchanging information among individuals and teams at all levels to create awareness, understanding, and alignment. Their mission is to help organizations better understand how to effectively communicate the importance of quality. Skills and competencies are focused on skills, training, and experience that enable an organization and its workforce to achieve and maintain a culture of quality. And their mission is to actually equip the workforce to have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to produce high-quality products and services when supporting patient safety. And then last of all is the implementation, and we're focused, our work stream is focused on supporting the industry in its efforts to actually implement everything that we just talked about a moment ago. And this includes things such as developing a portal, making these tools available, helping companies actually implement these pieces. So that's what our mission is. But right now we're going to turn it over to you and the panel to respond to some of those specific questions that we had posed earlier and see if we can get some answers more to help us move this very intangible initiative forward in an effective way. So let's start with disruptors, and I'm going to just be arbitrary and ask different people, keep you on your toes. The disruptors team asked, what innovative outcomes emanate from a disruptive activity that directly enhances an organization's culture of quality? Jackie, can I let you start with that one? Do you want me to repeat that?
Yes, please. What?
What innovative
phone a
outcomes
friend?
emanate from a disruptive activity that directly enhances an organization's culture of quality? The way I interpret that question is, how do you make lemonade out of lemons?
Yeah. So I guess it's going to depend on what the disruption was, right? So if we're thinking about a disruption that's completely unexpected, right? Some disruptions are expected, some are unexpected. So I'll think about something that I went through. Actually, we had a situation where we had some malware. We had a little bit of an attack, and that was quite a disruption. And so what we took away from that whole entire process was the fact that because we had solid processes and solid teams, we were able to manage around some of the issue. And it created a situation where we were able to look at where did we have holes, where we weren't going to be able to manage around that issue. So it was almost like a moving continuous improvement effort, where we were trying to continue to do the work. We'd see that we had nothing there. There was a void. We had no idea what we were going to do. So we created small pockets of knowledgeable team members to come together to create small workaround processes to continue to allow our business to move. So I guess what emanated from that was the idea that big problems could be solved by small, focused teams that were allowed to be slightly creative within a boundary. So we gave people boundaries. We said, you got to figure out what you need to do. We've got this much time, and we're going to walk away and let you do it. We're not going to micromanage everything that you're going to do. So I think that was really helpful for us to understand how to allow teams to be creative within the right boundaries. So the key from our leadership perspective was to give them the right boundaries. We're not breaking any laws and sending anybody to jail, right? We're not going to spend more than this amount of money. Other than that, figure it out.
So the process of remediation actually was a culture building.
Yep, it absolutely was.
Cisco, can you think of, in your experience, any situations where disruption and something that could have been bad actually resulted in a better outcome?
I could think of one or two. Let me see here. Well, first of all, Loretta, thank you for the presentation earlier. I took a slew away from that that are actually directly applicable to what's going on internally now that I've got to make sure I remember as I leave here. But you know, I think the idea of disruption, and when we're talking about these things, it's the fact that it forces you to challenge the status quo, right? Depending, doesn't matter what scale it comes at. But you know, even if we talk about our experiences here, right, the VIP program was a disruption to how we did things. I could tell you that, and Beleda can attest to it, because she took the brunt of dealing with that internally. You know, the modifications and the regulatory benefits we offered was a disruption to how we did things, but it improved the way we could get to the information. It improved the output. It improved our understanding of what was happening within the broader space, and enabled companies to move faster. COVID was a huge disruptor that challenged every status quo that we actually kept for a long time, and actually, you know, said, there's ways we could do this that are more efficient and more effective. And the notion that we had beforehand that it must be done in this particular fashion kind of went out the window, right? It was, we have a need, we have to get this done. And we could set the bounds of what's needed and established and still maintain the broader safety and efficacy piece, right? And a lot of what happened there is now being worked in and figured out, how do we make that more standing policy, right? Because it was that challenging of the status quo. And I think that's where the big opportunities lie within disruption.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else want to respond to that?
I did.
Go ahead.
Okay. No, go ahead, Ziller.
I think the opposite of that is you have to foster innovation thinking. You have to support your team before the crisis. You can't expect during the crisis for everybody to be able to think outside the box and be innovators. That's your culture. That's why that's so important before that happens. So when the disruption happens, it's just a bump. It's not, you know, taking people out at the knees. So I think it's important to bring in that innovation, teamwork, cross-collaboration, all that before.
Thank you. Loretta?
Yeah, I just want to give you a tip in terms of mechanics of executive teams after COVID happened. Before COVID happened, the CEO was always generally on the road, either with the board of directors or with his executive team or visiting customers, et cetera. And so were all the other members of the executive team. So we were always moving around. So it was impossible to get sort of even an emergency meeting scheduled because it was just very difficult. That all died with COVID. Everybody was in their offices, at their home. They were available 24/7. And so the speed with which you could escalate issues and actually get mind share was much greater and has been much greater post-COVID because most of the executive teams still are not traveling as much. And so that's been a real benefit. So don't be hesitant to, as you well know, to get on the agenda quickly because there's no excuse. 24/7, Zoom in, team in. They can do it.
Great. Thank you, Loretta. And that actually is interesting. It brings us to our next question, is the digitalization team. Before I read that question, though, an observation is that you know, the ability for us to switch to Zoom or Teams or whatever we did right when COVID happened was, I don't know if it's serendipitous or something from above, but the question, though, is that how do you maintain that culture? It's one thing when you're all in four walls and able to meet and develop relationships, but you know, this incredible enabler that came in the form of Zoom or whatever also presented huge challenges from a cultural perspective. I wonder if anyone could speak about how they addressed the impact of digitalization in terms of trying to maintain or build a culture of quality.
So I'll take that on, I think, a little bit. So in terms of disruption, turn the clock back a few years where a lot of the reason for implementing culture of quality came from some internal and external events. And it was that reaction at the C-suite level that really drove the implementation of the quality culture. Now, fast forward to COVID, that culture was in place. And so when you think about all of the front office folks or back office folks that were on Zoom, there was still a portion of the manufacturing group that was still on site. And that was a real challenge to try to keep them together and keep them focused on what was important. But I think the foundation of awareness and understanding, and I think George talked about this, about understanding what role you play when it comes to manufacturing products, and it could be used on someone, your family member, or someone sitting next to you. I think that really, that foundation and that awareness, I think, was something that we were able to leverage, whether we were on site a couple of days a week as management staff or alternating or remote. But they really, I think the employees really need to be congratulated in many ways for keeping it together, because they never really ever wavered. And I think you can probably see that by the work that we've been able to continue to do from a case for quality perspective, was that they were also engaged in keeping things moving forward while they were creating these life-sustaining, life-saving devices in a world where there was little, or I'll say reduced workforce or reduced management staff watching over what they were doing. And I think that speaks to the process and having things in place.
And I think that reflects what Hillary was talking about too, creating a resilient organization that has that sense of culture and mission.
But that doesn't happen overnight, right? I mean, and I think what we heard in the opening comments was, when you think about all of those things that are identified as, well, is it a now or never? Is it cost or is it ethics? I think the answers, and you mentioned it, the answers are yes to all of those questions, but they vary. And you can't have that conversation with the frontline employee unless the CEO and the C-suite is endorsing it.
You gotta
I think
walk
that's
the walk.
really where it starts. And so to be able to implement some of these things or leverage what you already have in place to be able to kind of reduce the cost of investment and things like that and leverage those things that you're already doing, that takes some of the pressure off of being able to implement these activities. So when you think about the playbook and you think about all those areas that you guys are focused on, leverage things that you already have in place and just maximize that opportunity to be able to take as much out of that communication process or reward process or whatever it might be.
The rewards is, I mean, so you had all these, half of your staff at manufacturing and then half remote. How did you reward them? Show them you appreciate everything they're going through to be there. I think that was, and that's important today. People like a pat on the back, a silly cutout certificate. I mean, I think it's important to recognize people.
Great, thank you. From the microphone.
Hi, yeah, Dory Gonzalez from ProCellRx. I was wondering where you guys fit in incentive alignment within the pillars that you identified in your culture for quality. Because if incentives are not aligned, none of this is going to matter, right? People are driven by what matters to them. And if we don't have leadership taking the right incentives, if we don't have bottom line driving up to the right incentives, right, we're not going to get the sustainable change that we want. And I think that's part of the COVID problem. Pro and con of COVID, right? We all had to change because we had no option. We didn't know what the outcome was going to be. But now we're in a place where we have a choice to either continue to move forward or not. And where are organizations at with aligning the incentive structure within organizations to continue that culture?
I think you may have identified the 8th pillar. Do you care to lead it?
I'd love to.
Well,
We got to volunteer. You've got to volunteer.
So yeah, I think that, so I've had the benefit of being on that side of implementing a culture of change. And a lot of it was driven through external issues and some internal issues. But the one thing that was really hard to overcome was that incentive piece. And it was really at the middle management level, because especially in a manufacturing location. So you had frontline employees being told, do the right thing, shut the line down if there's a quality issue, don't let it get down the line. And then you had management staff saying, quality begins with me, and the buck stops here. Then you had the middle managers who were being incentivized by hitting their tack times and hitting their deliveries and hitting their production schedules. But then in the same conversation, it was, well, you have to shut the line down if there's an issue. Well, am I incentivized on shutting the line down, or am I incentivized at hitting my number?
Exactly.
And so we had to really unravel that and empower that middle management staff to be able to make that right decision, and in a safe space, to understand that it was okay to shut the line down because the CEO was endorsing it. But again, it has to start from that top, down leadership, and really understanding what does it mean to be courageous? What does it mean to be, accountable, not just to the person sitting next to you, but accountable to your bottom line, accountable to that ROI, accountable to your investors and your stakeholders. But at some point, you just have to have the discipline to make those decisions. And it's a hard thing to do, but it's all about that incentive.
So how do you get the C-suite to understand culture of quality is so important?
Yeah, well, I've had the benefit of working for a couple of CEOs that really get it right away, almost to the point where we felt pressure if we didn't implement something. So it wasn't a matter, so the sell was not as hard, but being able to say, well, is it qualitative, is it ROI, or is it ethics? The answer is yes, right? Because it's the right thing to do, but you have to make that investment. But making that investment is leveraging the programs you already have. So if you're trying to drive an awareness program, don't go to HR and say, we need a new communications program, we need a new rewards program. Build it off of the platform you already have, right? If you have values and behaviors that are already ingrained in your mission and vision, change the value statement and provide examples of what it looks like to be living those examples of the right behaviors, and then reward and incentivize for that.
I would maybe add two things too, Joe, in terms of getting the C-suite on board. It's a couple things. One is don't lead with compliance. So I think a lot of quality folks, they make the mistake of coming through the door with compliance as the tip of the spear. It's a turnoff. It can be a credibility issue. You basically blow your credibility out of the gate. I think the second thing is don't treat it as a zero-sum game, right? To the extent where you talk about quality as part of the recipe to a successful business, right? In other words, by the way, if we do quality the right way, if we have stronger processes, we will actually deliver faster, on time, better outcomes, better top-line growth, because we start to command a premium in the market because our products are better than our competitors. To the extent where you can talk about quality in a way where it doesn't sound like it's a zero-sum game and I have to trade off other business objectives in order to achieve quality, that's going to work to your advantage. Those are, in my mind, kind of two key ingredients to making the pitch successfully.
Yeah, I agree.
Great, thank you, Kareem. Loretta, the leadership team wants to know what factors prevent leaders from successfully promoting a culture of quality.
I think it's consistent with the comments that were at the end of the panel here from the last few minutes. It's going in with sort of an attitude, as I'll call it. You need to do this because if you don't, we're going to get sued or something's going to happen with the line, et cetera. You got to go in with, in my opinion, a holistic story. And you've got to give them advice and guidance as to what could happen if we don't move forward with quality today versus in a year or 2 years. You got to basically, set that story up for them. But you got to be sophisticated in how you do it, because they will spot elements of a quality program like they've heard it 1,000,000 times. Yep. They've heard it 1,000,000 times. And so you got to go in there with something that's going to catch their attention and get them really jazzed up about it, is the way that I think about it. And Paul and I did that. We created a lot of stuff from scratch.
The educational experience I had.
Yes, for sure.
But I also think to that point that there's going to be a group that understands it, and there are roles in the organization that just are going to get it. But then the challenge becomes the enterprise, the rest of the organization, that feel further removed from the patient on the table or further removed from a quality issue because they think about, well, that's quality's job or that's someone else's job. And so it's being able to, Loretta, to your point about making sure you have a compelling reason and a compelling story for those that are further away from those things that we believe are just the no-brainers.
Yeah.
I mean, patient safety, everyone should be bought in on that. And so it's that challenge that we all as professionals have, and we've talked about this many, many times, is how do you go in with a qualitative, heartstring, we should do this, and then the CEFO says, well, what's my return on investment? How much is this going to cost me? And you may or may not know at the time, but unfortunately, if you have a external event, you pretty much know what it cost you already, and so now it becomes a avoidance versus an investment. So.
I mean, maybe you could even look at staffing. I mean, how many people stay? Or it's a hostile work environment. You have high turnovers, you can't fill staff. But when you love your job or you don't mind going to work, I mean, people tend to show up. I mean, I think that might be a good place to kind of start, like, we spend this much money training,
So speaking, go ahead.
One comment I also wanted to make about external events. One thing that I always did, and it's very effective, is that we could have a product line that's problematic, and we always kind of catch it before it finally gets out the door. What I would always say to the CEO, and particularly to the product leader on the executive team and the CFO is, yeah, we caught it, but it took 20 more resources. It took 20 more people in legal and compliance. And so when you add those salaries up, that product is not profitable. You can do it even when you can track it internally in terms of how much time and effort across the continuum, across the organization, that it takes to support these products that are not really quality, is the way I think about it.
I mean, if you want to create a rapid response team, and there's an external event, hold the site that manufactured that product that was responsible for execution for paying for the cost of that
Yes.
that activity, and you'll get rapid response pretty quickly.
So I think
Talking about incentive.
there is a connection there because we talked a little bit about the digitalization portion, right? As with regards to the impact of Zoom and all these things generally there. But what we saw and have seen is a lot more interest and engagement from companies at the leadership level to have the information and the insight readily available quickly. And that's the big opportunity for digitalization to drive the culture, because that's what they're looking to see. You get to some of that data, you get to some of that information. Oh, yes, we had these events quickly, visibly, they tell the story, but here's all the resources it took. And there is a lot more, as a result, again, from the COVID disruption, a lot more interest and support within the med device industry to try to get there. Right?
Interesting. The measurement team, their question is, how do you measurably correlate specific cultural aspects of your business to your business performance objectives? So again, ROI. But how do you do that when the accounting systems typically aren't focused on measuring amorphous things such as culture? There's no allocation or bucket.
No real, right. And you can pick certain things around execution, capability around execution. So are you seeing a change and a reduction in your non-conformances? Are you seeing a change or reduction in adverse events and things like that? Now, obviously, adverse events are escapes, so you want to certainly get it before it goes out the door. But sometimes, and this is where the regulatory and quality professionals struggle, it's intuitive. You know there's going to be an impact, but for somebody to actually put a number on it right away, you have to sort of let things play out. And I can tell you firsthand experience, it took us 3 years to show correlation, but we had C-suite support and everything was working and we had things in motion, things were getting better, but to be able to point to metrics, it took us a couple of years to get to that point. So you have to be patient. You have to trust the process, but you also have to have that leadership buy-in that things are going to get better.
Well, and another question for you, Loretta. You said you worked with a number of CFOs. I imagine the CFO has to be on board and willing to create the frameworks in order to measure cost of quality and the return on investment of good quality. Is that true?
That's true. And I think all of you as Tristans have a unique role here in that the CFOs really want the professionalism and the guidance that you have. Because they're into the books, they're into the numbers, and they don't necessarily get to stand up and try to see the things that we're all seeing. And so building that relationship with the CFO to be able to call him or her up and say, I'm just telling you, yeah, we avoided one here, but here's the cost associated with it. Or here's the investigation that we did internally in terms of here's what it turned out in terms of root cause analysis. Here's what the cap was going to look like. Here's how many years we're going to have to deal with these sorts of things. The CFOs are really your friends because they want to avoid problems as much as anybody probably on that executive team.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but with the experience that we've seen where you start and measure the cost of an escape or the cost of a recall, and you put it on the shoulders of that site, and that affects their variances. If you go after some of those obvious cost issues, then what you're measuring becomes sort of add-on later, right? Because to your point about the CFO, when we had the opportunity to show them how much a recall cost in this particular location, they were like, well, okay, well, now that we avoid that, where's our other opportunity? And then it became some of the things that you guys are all going to be familiar with is that scrap cost, planned scrap, anticipated scrap, right? The CFO, I'll never forget this. We were sitting in a management review meeting, and he was sitting against the wall, and he heard us talking about all of these costs, and we talked about the scrap rates and the embedded scrap rate. And he said, that's the number I want. I don't care about anything else. Give me my scrap rate. Get my scrap rates down. So how can you go into manufacturing knowing you're going to have a certain percentage of acceptable scrap? That's a clear opportunity. And it doesn't require a whole lot of measurement because it's already embedded. You already planned for it. So how can you try to avoid that and design quality in and reduce that expected scrap rate?
Yeah. Kareem, I was going to ask you if you could share some of your experience.
No, I agree completely with Joe. To me, I think a lot of companies get wrapped around the axle and tie themselves into a knot trying to come up with, the most complete, comprehensive cost quality number you can come up with. I've never found that to be a valuable activity. I think the right thing to do is you're probably already measuring quality performance, right? The most crucial thing you need to think about when you embark on one of these, quality culture initiatives or transformation is you've got to deliver the results. You've got to deliver the results. So
in a way which they understand.
Correct. It's got to be measurable impact. So whether it's reducing scrap or recalls or something, and we recognize that there's going to be a lag effect and all that's recognized, but you've got to deliver the results because the worst thing you can do from a credibility standpoint, from a quality from a stature standpoint within your organization is not deliver at the end of the day. I've seen organizations that have, zero defect culture, and you go around and you see the posters everywhere, and then, oh, by the way, through this double doors, this is our rework department. And you say, okay, something's wrong here, right? So that's the kind of thing that will completely dash your credibility. And the next time you want to invest in quality, you're not going to get the dollars because you didn't deliver the last time. So I think just focusing on a few simple metrics, being aggressive about it, and making sure that you actually drive tangible, measurable improvement, that's going to be the key to success.
Great, thanks, Kareem. So our next category, go ahead.
I want to just, one thing which is completely different from what you guys talked about, but it's a different way that I went about, very creative way to look at a metric to try and gauge whether our culture of quality was improving or not, which we would hope, and we've all talked about it, culture of quality improves, your costs go down. So one of the things that we were really seeing was really like some not great scrap. Things weren't getting done correctly. Of course, root cause is always people suck.
Human error.
Whatever. So fixing processes, fixing our training process, but we got really creative with how we were trying to look at whether all of the things that we were putting in place were working, because what we wanted to do was to see, were people actually doing were they executing the processes correctly to the procedures? And so instead of looking at the EQMS and saying everybody's, 90% training, whatever, that doesn't mean anything, to be honest. I'm trying to get FDA out of that. Quit asking me if everybody's trained on my procedure. It doesn't matter. So we had people go around, it doesn't. We go around, what we did is we put a process together where we had people from different groups go into other areas and do a very quick interview and say, hey, what are you working on? I'm working on this process. Okay, great. What procedure are you using? I'm using this procedure. Okay, great. Explain to me exactly what you're doing, and they'll say something. And the person who went in knew what they were supposed to be doing, knew what procedure they were supposed to be using, took a few notes, and over time we kept that data, and we were showing that the improvement in the number of times people were actually knew the procedure they were working on, were executing the things correctly, and were, not only that, they were trained on the right revision of the procedure that they were supposed to be working on. So we had lots of data. We went to all the different departments. We did this over about the course of a year, and we shared that data at the executive team. It was like, this is a better way to look at, are people really understanding what we're saying when we're saying, we want you to be trained and we want you to really understand what you're doing before you execute your work. If you don't know how to do it, don't do it, ask for help. So instead of just saying, looking at all of the training metrics, we tried to get a little bit creative at how we were doing that. And it took us about a year, but we really did see some excellent improvements, and we knew the groups that we had problems with, and we could then give them a little bit extra special care.
Somebody brought that up in continuous improvement about making sure people understood why their job served a purpose. So if I was inspecting something and I inspected 10,000 a day, I don't really see a purpose in my job. But if I know that I'm looking for holes in this surgical gown that is worn by this doctor and it's protecting him from blood getting through them and vice versa, I think it helps the people understand, the value in their job.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Jackie, for that experience. Communications, we have 3 more work groups waiting for answers, and the communications group is asking, what should businesses be communicating about quality? Jackie, do you want to try that one? What's the key message that leadership should be communicating about quality?
That we have it.
It's important.
I think there's so many things about quality that leadership should be communicating, but fundamentally, it's just really anything, talking about it, talking about that there is quality in what we do. What does quality mean to the leadership team? Because that's going to vary for every company. Quality is my kids ask me what I do. Oh, I do quality. They're like, what does that even mean? And I think they're like everybody else in the world, right? What does it even mean? So I think every executive has to, I don't even care if they use the Q word. There's a bunch of things that means to that company. That's what they have to communicate. They have to define it for their own company and communicate that down in different ways via different communication paths to different people.
Great, thank you. I see someone with another question, but I want to, before we leave that communications piece, Cisco, do you have an opinion in terms of what should leadership be messaging to the company
It
in
is
terms of
not
quality?
QA's responsibility. It belongs to everyone.
Right, yeah, for sure.
Yep.
And they have to walk the walk.
Right.
Leadership is the first off, last to leave. That's, I mean, they can't, say one thing and do another.
All right. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Hazar. I work for Alcon Laboratories. So thinking of quality culture and how we measure it, and then some of the comments that were made in terms of how people execute their jobs and things like that. So not thinking of product deviations, but process deviations, maybe someone doesn't perform the job correctly. Do you have any recommendations for how we would measure whether it's an improved quality culture or the quality culture heading in the wrong direction if we see an increase in reporting of process deviations, i.e. someone not performing the job correctly? Does that mean how do we decipher whether something's wrong with our quality culture or if there's an improved quality culture and people feeling empowered to report those types of events?
Good question.
I mean, yeah, that is a great question.
Anyone want to take a stab?
I think I'd start with the procedures itself. I mean, one, certainly they're trained, but is the procedure robust enough that it actually is supposed to yield the outcome? So are they figuring out a way to maybe bypass certain steps because it's more efficient? So I would actually bring the groups together that are showing those deviations and say, have you figured out a different way to do it? And you're actually creating these deviations because the procedure doesn't reflect what it requires to actually do your job. Because a lot of folks will figure out ways to bypass the procedure because they think it's more effective and more efficient, which is a no-no, but there actually might be pearls there that you can leverage to improve your procedure.
So maybe bringing them together or separate and have them explaining, how they perceive their job and what they're doing. Does anything bother them? Are they standing on a concrete floor, not a mat? Simple things. The table's too high. I think there's so many
Are
factors.
they getting it from the person sitting next to them?
Yeah.
And so they're forced to sort of deviate because that's the only way they can configure
But an increase in deviations
In a process.
from the process.
doesn't necessarily mean your quality culture. I understand your question. Where are you in, if you're at the very beginning of the journey of a quality culture and you've started talking about it already and there's awareness, an increase in nonconformances or
Good.
deviations might actually be a sign that your quality culture is improving, right? But if you've never started on the journey and this is status quo and you've had an increase, it might be the opposite.
Yeah, I agree with that. To me,
Yeah.
the answer is more information needed.
Yeah.
Right, in
Yeah.
order to figure that.
Yeah,
It's-
like I
she's
said, they may have
exactly
figured
right.
out a way that deviates from the procedure,
Yeah.
but it actually is more efficient and
And
more
it's
effective.
the danger of just relying on one metric
Right.
to tell
Right.
you anything, that
Yeah.
you really need a much more robust framework. We are running short of time. I see someone else with a question.
It's a good question.
Hi, Carolyn Candiello again. Thank you so much. I find this topic so interesting and fascinating, and being on the other side of the industry in healthcare. I'm curious, one of the things we use is storytelling to really help drive culture change, and I'm curious if that works in the manufacturing world as well, to really, I think one of you said, to drive down that importance of the why, we're doing what we're doing. And I'm just curious, when you think about communication, is that something you've built into your communication process?
I think it's a great thing to build. I think it's having resources on who to go to give those types of stories, being engaged with your customers, to come back and tell why that's important, to have that kind of relationship. I'm a learner that way. That's how I learn. So, I can read it all day long, but if you show me and explain that way, it's better for me. I don't think everybody does it. I think they should.
And I also think, to your point earlier about the rewards and recognition program, having facilities and people that have been rewarded for demonstrating the right behaviors to share those stories as to what it looks like then is infectious, because now everybody else wants to implement that and everybody else wants to get recognized for doing the right thing. So it could be teams within within a site, or it could be site to site sharing why they were recognized for having.
And put it everywhere.
And right, exactly. So storytelling is a huge plus.
Great, thank you. Our last category is skills and competencies. And Loretta, I wonder if you could opine on what are the essential skills that, whether it's leadership or really anyone in the organization needs in order to help build an effective quality culture?
I'm a big believer in interesting, engaging, and clear communications, whether it is standing up and making a presentation or writing a narrative or putting together a slide deck or having a one-on-one communication. You really need to put yourself, I hate to keep going back to this example, but I will. I mean, with Tristan and myself, it was really deer in the headlights. And so it was really fundamental that he find a way to communicate with me. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of terms in the ballroom dancing field. Turns, hold this, hold that, do this, et cetera. And so you have the same in the medical device quality industry as well. And so put yourself in the shoes of the beginning dancer or the beginning executive, or maybe even the executive who hasn't been briefed in 3 or 4 years if the regulations have changed. You've got to communicate that and find a way to get their attention early on. That's the most important thing. Because if you don't have that mindset with the communication in whatever form it is, you're dead in the water.
Thank you. Kareem, your thoughts?
I completely agree with Loretta. To me, and I hear this all the time from chief quality officers, the challenge that they have in terms of succession planning, building the leadership ranks within quality is that exact point, which is fluency, business fluency. I need folks that can communicate cross-functionally across the aisle, be persuasive. It's not the expertise. Like our whole quality team understands the regs and CAPA process, and we don't miss that. What we miss is people that can actually translate that, be the Rosetta Stone to the rest of the company. And that is the main capability and skill set that I think is missing and the most needed in order to bridge the gap on quality culture.
Joe, your thoughts?
I completely agree with comments. Ditto, right? Because it's about execution, right? When you think about arming them with the right tools and understanding that people learn at different rates and learn different ways, but then it comes down to execution. And so if there are folks that are struggling with execution, it may not be the procedure. It just might be the way they've learned or they haven't learned. And so go back to them and really engage with them on a different level so that execution becomes, really the whole Rosetta Stone piece is
All right, I've got to find an exception. Zillary, what is the most important skill?
I'm not gonna say ditto. I agree. But I think cross-training is important because when there's fires or when there's COVID and you lose half your staff and you want me to go do your job, but you never even showed me how to unlock your office, I think that's a problem. So again, you can't act in a fire unless you're prepared. So I think making sure your staff is cross-functionally trained.
Excellent.
But there's always that caveat too, that you want the most skilled folks in the most critical operations as well. So identifying what those critical operations are ahead of time, so you're not putting someone who is
Like me.
set up to fail versus someone who just has that skill set to be able to maximize that.
Thank you. Cisco, your thoughts?
Yeah, I wish you were going to hear something different from me. But it's the same one, and just even owning the fact that even internally, I'm still working and learning on this, right? That's a continuous process. It's as leadership changes or as they get more involved, each person has a different communication need and style, and you kind of have to stay on top of that. It's always picking up new ways to get that message across, because without that, everything else, you could be the best statistician out there, you could be the best quality person out there, but if you're not communicating it in the right way, it's not going anywhere. snacking in the
My
store out
last
there.
hope, Jackie.
I do think communication is critical, but a piece that I haven't heard yet that I think for me as I've progressed in my career, that's the biggest part of communication is first listening and really listening in order to be able to communicate correctly to the different groups. And I do think that there's a fair amount of listening that needs to occur first to really understand.
Great. Well, we're out of time, but I want to thank this panel for their excellent insights and helping the culture team figure out what it is that we have to be doing. So thank you so much.